On the next episode of Painting and Travel, we'll visit a North Carolina apple orchard where Sarah talks with the owner about the different varieties of apples. Roger uses acrylics to paint an apple still life, exploring facets of light and shadow.
We're spending some time here at our studio in Henderson County, which happens to be the largest apple-producing county in North Carolina. And it's apple season right now. It begins in late August and goes through the end of October. And what's fun to do here is take a drive on Highway 64, known as Apple Alley, and see all the beautiful orchards on either side of the road. This is a painting Roger did a while back of that area. It's a picturesque view, of course, of the drive because the road is paved, but you can see the trees are laden down with the beautiful fruit. Roger's going to do an apple painting, and later we'll visit an orchard.
I'm going to paint a still life of 2 apples. This will give us the opportunity to see how light and shadow affect form. We're outside in the bright sun, and using this white ball, we can more easily see what the effects of light do to this sphere. Let's take a closer look. Here on the sunlit side, we have what's called the center light, and then the highlight. This is, of course, the light from the sun or other bright source that is directly reflecting itself at just the right angle from the light to the ball and then directly to our eyes. Then right behind that, we have an area of halftone where the light begins to fade off. If this were a textured object, say for instance a basketball, it would be where most of the texture would be evident to the eye. Then we have the terminator line. That's this line right here. It's the transition between the sunlit side and the shadow side. Now this is fairly dark because it's not getting nearly as much light as the sunlit side, nor is it getting as much light from the backlit side where reflected light is influencing it. This terminator line is still lit, but from other weaker sources, maybe the sky or light bouncing up from the ground. Right behind the terminator shadow, we have reflected light coming from behind the object. This is called the form shadow, and I'll talk more about this later. Next, we have what's called the occlusion shadow. This is most likely the darkest part of the shadow. It's where the object makes contact with the ground. From the occlusion shadow, the cast shadow falls out to the side. So we have 2 shadows in one here as the occlusion shadow melds into the cast shadow. Here at the bottom, we have reflected light reflecting up from the base onto the sphere. Now, if it were overcast, these shadows and highlights might not show up very much, if at all. I have the apples set up here in a box, and I painted it black in here just to eliminate some of the other light that's above me. And I've put in a LED light that shines a good spotlight on these 2 apples. I'm using acrylics today, and I have on my palette titanium white, alizarin crimson, cadmium red deep, cadmium red light, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium yellow light, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, chromium oxide green, a green gold, a sap green, and 3 earth colors of burnt sienna, burnt umber, and yellow ochre. I'm using a lot of colors on my palette today, but since these apples are red and green, I thought I would put more of a variety of reds and greens on my palette. I'm just mixing up some neutral color here, and with my brush, just sketch these apples very quickly and don't need too much drawing here. Since these are acrylics, this outline is going to dry very quickly. Now let's try to apply some of those principles on form to these apples. I'll just start by blocking in what we call a local color. That's just one color of this green to the apple. After I apply this local color, then we'll start in putting in the highlights and these shadows and the reflected light. And I put that on rather thin so it will dry quickly, and I'll just smooth that with my brush. With the apple here, I'll take some of the reds, maybe some cerulean blue, and maybe a touch of white. And I'll paint this form just in a solid color. And I'll just apply this very thin. Now these apples are sitting on a white board, but of course that's not going to be totally white. If this were being lit by the sun or any object like this LED light, this is going to be very warm down here. I want to reserve my lightest lights for the highlights right on that apple. One of my main concerns right now is just getting the board covered. So I'm just putting this on quite thin, and I don't want very much texture up here. So after I apply this, I'm just going to take my brush, go back and forth at different angles and smooth that background out. Now I will be repainting this background, I'm sure, but I just want to get all this covered and get all that white off my board, off my masonite board. Now we have a lot of reflected light going on here, and I've tried several different backgrounds between the light, the apples, and that background. And I've chosen this warm piece of cardboard as a background. And as you can see, that makes a fairly nice tone right in here of this shadow. Now if I were to take this same piece of cardboard, and I've painted it blue on this side, you can see what happens to that shadow. This shadow becomes very blue, so any light that shines on an object also becomes a source of light itself. So the blue background becomes a source of light for this shadow. Now if I take a piece of red and swap this out, you can see that that shadow becomes very red in here. If I were to use a piece of white cardboard, that shadow almost disappears because the background becomes a source of light illuminating this shadow. That almost washes that shadow out. So that's why I have chosen this warm color here of this cardboard. It seems to give me just about enough light here illuminating this shadow in a nice way. Now the darkest part of these apples are going to be right underneath. That's the occlusion shadow like we talked about earlier. And this shadow happens on most all objects. It doesn't have to be this round object. It can be the leg of a table or any object that's set down close to the floor like this. Now this occluded shadow fades out fairly quickly, and it just becomes a cast shadow. Now that cast shadow will also have some reflected light from the apple. So I'm going to put some red in here as well, because not all the reflected light is going to come from that piece of cardboard, because some of that reflected light is going to come off the apple and onto this area here. Now a shadow will start out as a very hard edge, and as it moves away, as the shadow moves away, that shadow gets softer and softer. So right here, the shadow will have a hard edge right in there. And as it moves further out here, that shadow becomes softer. And you can't really tell it that much on this small object. But these shadows and these principles apply to all things, even buildings and landscapes outside. Now here we have the occluded shadow, and let's paint the cast shadow now from this apple. Now the apple will cast a bit of a green color, and it's also going to have light reflected off this red apple. So we've got two influences going on here. Makes it a bit complicated. So we have some of the red reflecting back from this apple, and some of the green also reflecting down onto the shadow. Also on this red apple here, we'll have a lot of reflected light from this green apple. So I'm going to take my green and bring it over into this apple, and that's the reflected light there. Now the green apple is in front of the red apple, so I'm not getting as much reflected light from that red apple as I am in here. So I won't have so much red reflected light here. Okay, so here we have the darker side of this apple. And I'll soften that. Right, I'm going to continue with this painting in just a few minutes, but right now, let's join Sarah at the apple orchard.
Welcome to Granddad's Apples. We'll go inside and meet one of the owners. This is Leslie Lancaster, and she and her husband Pat own and run Granddad's Apples. How did you get your start here?
My husband inherited this property about 1991 from his granddad. That's where we get the name. And this was his old homestead. I planted all the apple trees in 1994, rebuilt the barn, and started our business.
Well, that's a bold move. I know that apples grow well in Henderson County.
Henderson County is the 7th largest apple producer in the United States, so we are very big.
How did you decide what varieties you wanted to grow? Did you have to experiment a little?
We went with a lot of the newer varieties, and we tried to get some varieties that came in early, that come in around Labor Day for the Apple Festival that comes here to town.
Oh, that's a big deal, the Apple Festival in Hendersonville.
That draws about 250,000 people a year. 3 days.
3 days worth of apple enjoyment. Well, at Granddad's, you can pick your own.
You can also pick your own. We pick, or you pick, whatever you prefer.
Well, that's kind of fun. There's 2 ways to pick then. You can go and pick it off the tree, or you can come in here and get a chance to go through the barrels. And do you have each one labeled as to what?
We do, yes. Right now we have, I think, about 10 or 12 varieties in season. We're just waiting on about 4 more to finish up the season.
And do you give people a free taste?
We do samples all day long. We do samples of our hot cider donuts. We do samples of apples. We do samples of cider that we make here on the property. We are full of samples.
I guess that's why the place smells so good. It must be apple cider donuts.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, do you have a personal favorite that you look forward to every year?
My current favorite is one called Shizuka. It's an early Mutsu, and that's one of our newer varieties, but one that I always fall back on is a Golden Delicious. Just sweet, crunchy, juicy, fresh off the tree, like eating cotton candy for me.
Do different apples have different purposes?
Some are for cooking, some are for just eating, some are for only cooking.
Leslie, if I wanted to make an apple pie, what would you recommend?
I would actually suggest the one that you're holding. That is a Jonna Gold. It's a cross between a Jonathan and a Golden Delicious. The Jonathan gives it just a little bit of tartness, and the Golden is sweet. And that apple will cook all the way through and still hold its shape.
Oh, I see. So when you cut your pie, it looks good.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I can't wait to go home and make a pie. But first, I think I'll need to pick some apples. So how do I do that?
You decide on the amount you want to pick, if it's a 5-pound bag, 10 pounds, or 20 pounds, and then we send you on your way out into the orchard.
Really? You don't have to be supervised? You can just go on your own?
That's right. You're unsupervised and take your own time.
So there's an element of trust here that the customers will do the right thing and only pick the ones that are in season.
That's right. Everything is labeled, and so we do send you in the right direction.
And children can go out and
absolutely
have their way with the trees?
Absolutely.
That's really nice. Well, Leslie, I can see that the crowds are beginning to come, so I'll get my basket and get on my way. And it was very nice talking with you and learning about apples in Henderson County. I always feel the beginning of a season is very exciting. Spring's flowers, summer's early heat, and the fine pumpkins and apples of fall. The apples are so luscious, and with just a few twists of the stem, it's mine. There's a great satisfaction in filling your own bag with each special apple you've picked. Being in the orchard helps me appreciate what a lot of work apple growers go through to produce such a fine crop that gives great pleasure to so many people. Going to a you-pick orchard like Granddad's is a fall rite of passage and a great deal of fun. I'll come back next fall too for more donuts, more apples, and a look at the pumpkins.
Now these apples aren't solid colored forms. They do have a lot of variation in them, especially the red apple there. So the red apple does have some yellowish, yellow ochre tones in it. And they're most evident up here where the light is hitting it. Now again, this green apple is influencing this red apple quite a bit. So we'll bring some of this green color and this lighter color over into here. We cannot see that terminator line very well because of the lighting here. It's so close to the objects. But knowing that these terminator lines do exist, let's put one in. And on this green apple, this terminator line would be right about in here. And that terminator line will be the darkest part of this apple. So what's happening here to create that terminator line is this light is hitting this part of the apple at the strongest point. This becomes in shadow, and over here we have the reflected light. So in between, it just becomes darker. And I'll refine that as we go along. Let's jump over to the red apple. And let's do the same thing here with that terminator line. So that'll be the dark part of the apple. So knowing about the reflected light helps to create some harmony within these paintings, because each item is not separate from each other. Each item influences the other item as far as the color and the light is concerned. So that creates a lot of harmony in here, because the green reflects the red reflects the green, and so on. It just makes an association with those two objects. There are several kinds of shadows, and one is a form shadow and the other is a cast shadow. This, of course, here is a cast shadow. And on this side, this is called a form shadow. I prefer to just say that it's in shadow. That's just what it means. It could be the side of a house that's in shadow, and then you have a cast shadow that casts a shadow out onto the lawn. So that's the difference. One is a form shadow and one is a cast shadow. I think I will start to put a few of the highlights in here. And right here will be the lightest part of the apple. Now you might think the highlight would be on the very edge of the form here, but it's not, unless it were backlit, because when the light hits this apple, it's really bouncing off at an angle where the light itself, that LED light, is reflecting and bouncing towards my eye. Now as I move around that apple, the highlight will change. But the lightest part is not on this edge, because that is turning away from me, so that's not getting the brightest part. The brightest part is getting reflected from that light to my eye, and that's right here. Now let's go over and we'll put that highlight on this apple here on the right, the red apple. You know, wash my brush out, dry that off, and I can soften this edge. And right next to this terminator line, we will get some reflected light from the background there over into this area of the apple right here. That will bring that terminator line out better as well. The darkest part of this cast shadow would be here. And it gets lighter as it goes back, and it also, as I said earlier, gets softer. And that apple is reflecting its own light down here, especially close to this area. There'll be more red influence. I'll mix up a dark color with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And let's just put these stems in here. The background needs some attention because this is too much texture there. So I'll mix this up once again and make a warm neutral color. And I need to mix enough of it now so it'll cover the whole area here. I can also use my spray bottle here. This is perfectly dry now. If I give that a light spray, this paint will flow over the dry paint very easily. Really, I just wanted to get rid of all that texture because there's some nice texture in the apple itself. And the texture in the background as it was is really fighting with the nice textures in the apples. And also, this will help me to define the edge of the apple. Got a nice sharp line in there. So I apply that on, then with a light touch of my brush, go over that to flatten it out. I may vary the colors back here. So I'll add some blue here. Now I am getting some other shadows in on these apples from my lights overhead, but I'm kind of trying to ignore that because I just don't want too many sources of light in this painting to confuse things. And sometimes I have to go over this a number of times to get it right. Now I'm losing my shadow. That's okay. This happens all the time because one color affects another color, like we've been talking about. And when I changed this background, it really affected the way this shadow looked. So I'll have to redo that shadow. This is really a process that has to build upon itself all the time. If I were using oils, I could blend these much easier, but the disadvantage would be that I might get some of these colors muddy, and if I had to rework some of these areas, for instance in here, it might not be quite as easy. The disadvantage of the acrylics is that this is all dry, and it's a bit harder to blend them together. Okay, my white again, right here, and right there. Now typically this highlight would be a warm color, so I'll mix some yellow ochre with that. And if I pick up my sprayer, give that a slight mist, I can blend those quite nicely. And maybe a touch of pure white right in the center there. I'll darken that one more time. That's sort of a combination of the occluded shadow and the cast shadow. It's very dark right there. I think I'll add some more of that occluded shadow right over here on the right. Now this apple is sitting right close up against that brown piece of cardboard, so I'm not getting much of a shadow in there. The cardboard is really reflecting so much light into here, I'm not seeing a very dark shadow. But I'm going to make it dark just for the sake of the painting. Okay, now one thing we haven't dealt with at all is the reflected light from the white board that the apples are sitting on. I think I'll take my little box here with my razor blade, clean my palette. Okay, the reflected light. All right, we'll take some of the light greens. Now this is, and maybe some yellow. Now this is light that's hitting that whiteboard and bouncing up onto the apple. So there's a whole lot of influences going on here all the time. So right under here, we'll put that reflected light. And it bounces up very close to the edge of that occluded shadow. Over here, we'll take some of the cadmium red light, maybe a touch of white, and I'll get some of that reflected light up from this white surface the apples are sitting on. Mixing an orange color, and right over here I'll put a touch more reflected light. Of course, the source of that reflected light is coming from the LED light, but then it's bouncing off the wall of the box, and that wall becomes its own light source. And we'll put some reflected light right on this side. With some thick white paint, I'm going to touch that highlight once again. Okay, now these apples do have some texture in them. They're not just pure red, pure green. Let me see if I can add some of the colors on this, especially on this red apple. We sort of have a secondary highlight coming off the lights above me here, and it's hitting right in here. And it's also hitting this green apple as well. It's really an awful lot of influences going on here with the light. Red and blue. I'm going to thin this, maybe make it slightly darker down here. I put that on, I wipe my brush off, and then with my brush slightly damp, I can drag that around. Now, there is some influence from this red apple onto the green one. So I'm going to put some of this reflected light from the red apple right on the edge. As I said earlier, this green apple is in front of the red one, so I'm not getting as much of that reflected light as I have on the red apple, but there is some right on the edge here. So this red apple is reflecting onto this green apple here and creating this warmish cast right there. Right here I'm going to lose the edge of this apple, sort of make it blend into the background. Then I'll accentuate this side of the apple slightly. That'll give some distance to these apples. The green one, of course, is in the foreground, and by softening that edge, it sort of pushes the other one back a ways. There are little freckles on the skin of the apple here. So I'm just going to add a few of those. And the apple on the right, the same thing. I think I'll spray this with my spray bottle there. That way when I place these little dots in, the wetness of the board will help to diffuse those spots, make them softer. And if the spots just look too strong, I can take a brush and just drag that brush over these and soften them. I don't want them to stand out very much. Well, that will finish the painting of these two apples, so I'll leave you with a few other paintings I've done of apples in the past.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.